feels like, and I live here in Germany, that there's increasing awareness and willingness to do this, partly because they know that if the U.S. quits and Ukraine fails, it will be really bad for Europe in so many different ways. So I think there's a grim realization of that. But you're right that is what the Soviets always wanted and what the Russians want, to separate the U.S. from Europe, and this will create that possibility.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of On the Edge. Our guest this week is retired U.S. General Ben Hodges, who we've actually had on the show before, way back in episode 4. But it's a new year, so we thought we'd check in with him again. Not least of which because this could be quite a pivotal year, with a new U.S. administration coming in the form of Donald J. Trump, who, while he was on the campaign trail, promised that he would find a negotiated settlement for the conflict. Although at the same time, he has expressed repeatedly his admiration and his warm feelings towards Vladimir Putin. Inside Putin's Russia this year, the economy is definitely stretched and straining, many analysts saying that it is likely that there could be some form of collapse coming. On the battlefield for the forces of Moscow, the body count keeps rising and rising. It is estimated that within the first part of this year, it is likely that they will cross the 1 million man casualty mark. For the Europeans next door looking in at this, they are worried that this carnage could spill over into their own countries, and without a reliable partner in the United States, could they defend themselves? This is all also in the aftermath of a series of hybrid attacks and infiltrations into their elections that has many in Europe concerned that a reinvigorated Moscow could pose a danger to them at home. Within these borders, here in Ukraine, the people continue to suffer, and the exhaustion is palpable. But equally at the same time, the attitude here overwhelmingly is that any peace that might come in 2025 must be just and lasting. We talk about all of this and so much more. I hope you'll find it informative. So, General Hodges, we here at On the Edge are happy to have you back on the show. You're our first repeat guest, and great to see you in 2025. I know your time is in high demand, so I want to get right to the questions.
Thanks for the privilege to come back on your program, and yes, of course, all of us are busy, but I still appreciate the chance to do this, so thanks.
Well, as you and I have discussed in the past, I think it is very important for us to keep pushing forward information coming from the Ukrainian side of the narrative and not just let Moscow dominate that sphere. So a rising tide lifts all boats, and I appreciate it very much. So one of the questions that is at the top of everybody's mind is the capacity of both armed forces. Certainly, Ukraine seems to be mostly on defense, although obviously they're also taking offense into the Russian Federation by their incursion into Kursk, and we'll talk about that. But what I want to talk about is Russia's capacity to push its military aims. What do you think is the capacity of both armed forces as we go into this new year, both in terms of defense and offense?
Yeah. Well, look, for sure, it's difficult to know exactly production potential inside of Russia. I don't trust any numbers that ever come from there anyway. But I think there are a lot of indicators that would tell us that they cannot sustain an adequate level of production of equipment and ammunition indefinitely, partly because of the impact of sanctions, partly
Mhm.
because of the diversion of men who worked in the industry into the armed forces. And so there are different reasons for it. This is why Russia has to depend on North Korea for most of its ammunition, for example. Uh, so I think that the Russian ability to produce as much as they lose has been damaged. Marcus Koip is a scientist who I follow. He's probably one of the best in terms of understanding the actual economic potential of Russia and their production. He looks at that very closely, and I would encourage you to get him on your program. He works in Zurich. Now, um, another indicator of the degradation of Russia's abilities comes from Syria. The fact that Russia could not prevent the collapse of the Assad regime was very telling to me, because this would have been such a high priority for the Russians to hang on to Syria because of their navy base there in Tartus and their air bases. And yet we all saw the picture just the other day of the last Russian submarine heading west out of the Mediterranean because they could no longer take care of it there in Syria. This is a significant blow to Russia's ability to operate in the region, and it goes to the fact that they don't have the capability to do that anymore. So these are the kind of things that I look at and try to assess their ability to keep fighting. Now, it's never going to be about casualties for them. They clearly don't care how many casualties they suffer. I mean, the numbers are between 700 to 800,000 killed and wounded. But that's not been the problem for the Kremlin, at least so far. The 12,000 reported the reported 12,000 North Korean troops there. I think President Zelensky said the other day that at least a third of them or a quarter of them are already killed or wounded or captured. So Russia will keep looking for other bodies, trying to avoid drafting out of Moscow and St. Petersburg because they don't want to have funerals going through those streets. But otherwise, it won't be about casualties. It will be about Putin realizing that he cannot win. So economic factors will be a part of that. And then the determination of the American president will be a critical part of that.
And all of those topics I have already on my list of questions here, and we will address them in turn. But before we leave this question of capacity and who can reasonably expect to take what and what territory is at risk, I have often said, as I'll put on my journalist hat and my analyst hat, that they struggle to take a place like Chasiv Yar, the Russians do, and they pay a massive price for it.
Yeah.
They're fighting desperately to take Donbass and ultimately maybe aim for a city like Kramatorsk, which would be I've been to Kramatorsk. It's a fortress. It's a industrial town, and they will make the Russians pay for that extensively. With the forces that they have at their disposal currently, do you think the Russians can take a major city, not Kramatorsk? I'm talking Kharkiv, and more particularly Odessa and Kiev. Is it in their means to take those cities?
No, I don't think so. You remember it was about 11 months ago. I was in Munich at the Munich Security Conference February last year when the Russians finally captured Avdiivka after many months. And people there in Munich were going, "Oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen," as if it was Stalingrad or something. And I thought, wait a minute. And I look on my map, and of course, Avdiivka is about as far in the east of Ukraine as you can get. So it had taken forever to get that. And from Avdiivka up to Pokrovsk is about roughly 65, 70 kilometers. In 11 months, the Russians have not been able to cover that distance. And that tells me that they don't have the ability to exploit even local tactical success. Not the way their grandfathers did. there is no big breakthrough and then a giant red arrow that goes 70, 80, 100 kilometers deep into the rear of in this case, the Ukrainians' defenses. They don't have it. I mean, you may have a lot of bodies, but if you're using golf carts and civilian vehicles to try and find gaps, they just don't have that mobile firepower that can move at depth into the Ukrainian defenses, because that not only does it require the vehicles and kind of a level of training and mobile firepower, it also requires logistics to sustain something like that. And
supply chains and things like that.
I just don't see that capability.
And not only, and you're right, they don't necessarily care about body count. That is a Western perspective when it comes to military expense. What the Russians care about is empire. It's their prestige that they want. It's the resumption of their empire and the control of that territory. They're already, as you mentioned, at the 800,000 casualty mark. They will, at some point in the coming year, cross the 1 million man mark for their casualties, and I suspect that they will keep going. So it is interesting to me to hear you say that, and also interesting for me to hear you say that it's unlikely, in your belief, in your estimation, that they'll be able to take a major city. In particular, there are two cities. I mean, losing Kharkiv would be disastrous. All the cities along the river would be disastrous. But what they really need to do, Putin needs to do, is he needs to take, well, among other things, but two primary strategic goals has always been to change the government in Kiev and to take Odessa, because of their need to have dominion of the Black Sea. So as much as I hate to ask an army commander, a ground fighter, I'm going to have to ask you a naval question. I apologize for that, but I'm going to have to ask a general question maybe that's more suited for an admiral. This has been disastrous for Russia's ability to project naval power. They're bottled in now in the Baltic because of Finland and Sweden's ascension to NATO. It's now it's a NATO pond. I mean, they're blocked in there. The Black Sea fleet is no longer viable in Sevastopol, so why do you even need the land bridge? They've had to move the Black Sea fleet to Novorossiysk on the far eastern banks of the Black Sea, and as you mentioned, their loss of their ability to project naval power from Syria. They have always aspired to be a great naval power. How disastrous do you think this is for their capacity to project their naval influence globally?
Well, Ukraine has changed the character of naval warfare, at least littoral naval warfare, with their defeat of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and doing it without a traditional navy that was heavily dependent on surface warfare manned ships. They've done it with a combination of maritime drones, aerial drones, long-range precision strike, special forces, sabotage, and anti-ship missiles. So it's incredible to me how well they have managed to push the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of the Western Black Sea. And they went about it in a way that I think shows real clever tactical and operational skill. You know, if you go into Sevastopol, this great harbor, the reason that Catherine the Great took Crimea back in the late 18th century was because of, what that would offer the Russians for their navy for the Black Sea. Well, now Ukraine, using a couple of Storm Shadow missiles, destroyed the headquarters. We all watched that over and over and over, that video. And then, more importantly, they destroyed the dry dock facility in Sevastopol. And even I, as an infantry officer, know that the Navy needs maintenance facilities for their fleet at their home port. And so without that dry dock, it became very difficult for the Russians to sustain the fleet there in Sevastopol, which is part of why they had to move. But also, this revealed or made it very clear how vulnerable they were. I mean, there's no place to hide there. And with the development and procurement of long-range precision strike capability that you get with Storm Shadow, Scalp, ATACMS, there's no place to hide. And so they were vulnerable. And I think the Ukrainians did a terrific job. And now, of course, the Russians can still launch caliber missiles from ships even out of the Caspian Sea. So it's not like they can't strike Ukraine anymore, but their ability to disrupt grain shipments, for example, coming out of Odessa, or in the future to disrupt operations along Ukraine's southern coast, significantly reduced.
Yeah, and to my mind also, as we talk about their ability to withstand large numbers of casualties, as long as their prestige and their place on the globe and their empire is restored. I mean, in one fell swoop, you've got a man in the Kremlin who is overseeing. Catherine seeks those warm water ports because Peter says to Russia at the beginning of the 18th century, having seen English or Dutch naval expansion in the empire, Peter says we have to be a naval empire. Catherine takes that territory for a warm water port. They look upon access to the Mediterranean as sort of a pathway to their third Rome, is a terminology they like to say in Moscow. And under one leader, all of those aspirations have been destroyed. So when the chips fall where they may, I think if it stands where it is, he's in deep trouble. But let's talk about a little bit more, if you'll oblige me. We can maybe turn to a strategic analysis of it as opposed to asking you to be a naval expert, although I'm sure you're perfectly capable in that as well. Yeah, it's not that hard. It's all about boats. It's all about boats at the end of the day and shipping lanes. To wit, my point, a lot of consternation has been made about our incoming, presidential administration under Donald Trump saying, take Greenland, take Canada, take back Panama. These are the through line there is shipping lanes as the Arctic recedes. But we also see that in Russia as the Arctic recedes over the Northeast Passage. With the diminishment of their ability to exert naval power because of this conflict, let's look at a little geopolitical strategy. It seems both sides, or both sides of the equation, are looking at shipping and naval power. What do you think about this analysis that the new administration is fixating on these things because they are looking at naval power as opposed to Russia's diminishment of naval power in a geopolitical sense?
So you can argue about what causes climate change, but you cannot argue that it's happening. And so every day, every month, the ability of ships, large commercial ships, to move through the Arctic region improves. It was just a couple of years ago that you had the first time in the history of the world that we know of that a ship was able to sail over the top in the month of February. It was a Chinese vessel following Russian icebreakers. So the northern trade route is what we're talking about, that the Chinese are very, very interested in because it's about 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers shorter than a shipping route that goes through Suez in the Mediterranean, and it's about 5,000 shorter than going down through around Africa. So strategically and economically, this is very important to the Chinese, and the Russians, of course, welcome this, but they also point out that this is theirs to control, and they've got built up over many years installations and military capabilities that can kind of help them control that. They also have a large
And also take a toll. I mean, they can, you have
Well,
got to
that's the
pay
point.
to go through that
That's the
shipping
point.
lane.
They control it. They've said, we welcome people to come along here, but you're going to have a Russian pilot come on board your ship. You're going to have to follow Russian icebreakers. And of course, that will be a money-making operation, as has happened for centuries wherever somebody controlled the waterways. Now, so there's one strategic significance of this. And I think all of us in the alliance, not just the United States or Canada, but the alliance are taking a look at how do we reassess the challenges and opportunities. What do we need in terms of combat power, maritime power especially, but also air power to protect our interests? You remember during the Cold War, there was this thing called the GIUK gap: Greenland, Iceland, UK. So think about Hunt for Red October. When Soviet submarines came into the North Atlantic, they were headed through that GIUK gap, and so we had ships, we had bases on Iceland, Greenland. We still have a base in Greenland, by the way, thanks to Denmark allowing us to have it. The Danes had radar on Faroe Islands. I mean, there was a whole network of sensors and capabilities to react to it. We're having to do this again. And I think the idea of having more military capability in Greenland, for example, is a good one. The problem is we shouldn't be threatening a neighbor or an ally to let us do it. We should be saying, hey, can we expand our footprint? And right now, by the way, we don't have the naval capacity to really expand. Our Navy is way too small. We should be pressing our allies to do more in the GI-UK gap.
That's great. Thanks. Let's take it back to now that we've discussed kind of bigger global issues and geopolitics. Aside from all this loss of naval capacity for Russia, another embarrassment for Putin is that the Ukrainians, almost completely unexpectedly, have taken the fight into the Russian Federation, into Kursk Oblast. What is your take on, and we've seen even now a second kind of spearhead into Kursk. What's your take on what's going on in Kursk and maybe a little bit of a prognosis or a prediction with what's happening there?
I think as we look back on the war and this part of the war in coming years, people are going to point towards the Kursk counteroffensive by the Ukrainians as one of the most important and brilliant strokes of the war by either side. I know that it was criticized by some people who are not familiar with warfare or maps, and they thought, why did the Ukrainians pour all these people up there? Why didn't they send them out to the east? What a waste of manpower that would have been. The Ukrainian General Staff could see exactly what you and I spoke about earlier, that the Russians were not going to break through anywhere. Yes, they can grind, they can attrit, and it would absolutely suck to be a Ukrainian soldier out there around Kursk. But just putting more troops out there is not really going to change the balance, and the Ukrainian General Staff could see that they could accept risk out there, that there was not going to be a breakthrough. So instead, they thought, how do we do something that strategically, operationally, and tactically changes the narrative, creates opportunity, and causes problems for the Kremlin? So the idea of the counteroffensive into Kursk is exactly what anybody that understands the operational level of war would do. Every commander wants the initiative. You want the enemy reacting to you versus you always reacting to the enemy. So what happened with this attack? Well, first of all, it completely changed the narrative that somehow Russia's invincible, that there's no way Ukraine can win. The Ukrainians managed to get a large force on the border of Russia without being detected. I mean, that's incredible. When the Russians, all we hear about is, oh my God, they have drones everywhere, it's impossible to hide, it's the end of tanks. What did the Ukrainians do? They massed a large armored force that blew through Russia's defenses on the border and got deep into the Kursk Oblast. So there's several things about that are so impressive to me about electronic warfare, about the disciplined operational security. It's not like they were out in the middle of nowhere. It also highlighted one of the major problems that the Kremlin has had to deal with from the beginning is their command structure. The FSB is actually responsible for border security. So border forces are under a different agency, not the Ministry of Defense or the General Staff. So you've got, you don't have a coherent, unified effort on the Russian side. They still have not fixed that. That's why this latest offensive, or the next phase, if you will, that started a little over a week ago, they were able to do it because the Russians still have not addressed the problems of who's responsible for the area.
Yeah.
And so you don't have good intelligence assessment. Russian mail bloggers were complaining that why don't we have reserves here? I mean, how the hell have they not done that? So at the strategic level, it creates a dilemma for the Kremlin. It created a dilemma that still exists. Number one, do you just let it sit and hope it goes away, or do you start pulling resources from other places, which is what they did? And then what happens if negotiations are going to start? And Lavrov had said, okay, well, the start point for is whoever controls what, that's the start point for negotiation. Well, that would mean that Ukraine would be in possession of an important part of a significant oblast of Russia. So there's a negotiating dilemma as well as a dilemma, an operational dilemma about whether or not to divert resources. So that's probably too much. The good news is that the Russians have still not fixed their command structure. They've been caught by surprise again, and I think Ukraine will stay there as long as they feel like they get value out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a real problem on their side in terms of command. And also, I remember when the original offensive into Kursk was launched from this side of the border. I believe it was Sumy Oblast where they organized that spearhead. And I remember distinctly, and this is a compliment to the command here, is that it was sold as the Ukrainians were afraid that the Russians were preparing an offensive, and they let the Russians believe that the high command here was falsely believing that there was going to be a Russian thrust and that this mobilization in Sumy was a defensive posture when it was actually an offensive posture. It was a warcraft and Makarovka, the kind of the tricking of your enemy into believing one narrative, not another, and it was genius. So at the high command in Ukraine, I have all sorts of respect, but it does lead me to a problem that I think we do have to discuss within the Ukrainian forces, and it may not be the high command, but there is clearly a problem in certain levels of command, because we do have issues with. We've seen some desertions. We've got a mobilization problem, which people are resisting, not because they don't want to fight for Ukraine. I live here. I speak to young men who are willing to fight for Ukraine. They don't want to live under Russia's thumb, but they're concerned about the corruption and the mismanagement at mid-level officers. And kind of like we saw a unit getting deployed with a serious lack of drones, for example, and complaints about corruption in a certain strata of the officer corps. There are reforms that need to be made in the armed forces of Ukraine. It's undeniable. They admit it themselves. Can they both fight a war and make those reforms, do you think?
It's the best time to do it. I mean, you've got a sense of urgency to get it right, to make the most out of your resources. And so it is in the interest of the government to address these issues. At the end of the day, warfare is it's a test of will as well as a test of logistics. And we've known since before the time of the Roman legions that soldiers fight for who's on their left and right, trusting in each other, depending on each other. It's not about the flag. It's about, can I count on my commanders? Can I count on who's on my left and right? And so this trust is such an important part of combat. Not what you have in terms of technology, but do you trust who is leading you and who's fighting alongside of you? So getting the leadership right is important. rebuilding the confidence of soldiers that the government is doing everything it can to give them everything they need, including good leadership as well as equipment, rations, etc., is important. Now, I think a lot has been said about the lack of Ukrainian troops. There's not enough troops. That's true, but it's not a population thing. It's about people that are in uniform, and I think this is the job of the government to regain or gain the confidence of Ukrainian families that their son or daughter is not going to be wasted, that they will not be sent to the front until they have been properly trained, properly equipped, and put into a unit that's properly trained. So that requires a significant amount of overhead as well as a political commitment, if you will. We call it the institutional army. That's who does recruiting, basic training, officer education, provides the stuff. That's a lot of people involved, and you have to have quality officers and non-commissioned officers to administer that institutional army so that you can generate the operational army. And I think Ukraine is has not embraced that or fully developed that yet, although there, as you would know, there are lots of examples of quality people involved in training and trying to get these things right.
Well, and the more that we can send them our kind of kit, which focuses on survivability. I came under fire in Iraq in a Bradley, and we survived 7 RPG hits and walked away from it. And I'm able to conduct this interview with you today because I was inside a Bradley as opposed to some sort of Soviet style where they don't really care about survivability. But Ukrainians need their soldiers to survive because not only do they have less of them, but they want them to be experienced and they want to provide them the assurance that they will survive. But why is it that they're having to produce their own drones? Why are they doing fundraisers to get things like food or munitions? This is a problem within the military that I'm hoping they will address.
But Phil, let me touch that real quick. You can be sure that even the United States Army is not able to deliver everything to its soldiers that it needs. I was in Iraq 2 years and in Afghanistan for a year, and you still had soldiers would get things from their parents, some basic things in some cases. Obviously, we have the luxury of probably being one of the richest armies on the planet, but still, you couldn't always deliver everything that was needed. So I think that you're going to always have some challenges on the delivery of what would seem to be basic stuff, even in the Ukrainian forces, but getting the structure right for that. On the issue of desertion, this is something that obviously has to be dealt with, but it almost always boils down to leadership, not because soldiers think they're in a hopeless position, but because they're not confident that people are caring about what's happening to them. You remember George Washington, he dealt with desertion on a daily basis. I mean, our great Continental Army that we celebrate that helped us win our independence was a tiny, tiny little army. Not everybody wanted to fight. Not everybody was in support. And a lot of people deserted or left, even in the middle of the war. Same thing in the American Civil War. When their enlistment ran out, said, I'm out of here. So there has to be this commitment to a long-term, sustainable system that ensures adequate trained troops and proper equipment and rations and ammunition and repair parts are delivered.
Yeah, and it's I want to push back against Moscow's narrative that they when they put out these videos of like guys getting dragged off the street, or they capitalize on this desertion, which was more about frustration with leadership and with with the equipment they were being deployed with. But the narrative Moscow pushes is that Ukrainians don't really want to fight this fight. And I can categorically tell you, having lived in this country during the entire period of the full-scale invasion, that is simply not true. The desire to resist Russia is omnipresent. It is the it is the overwhelming motivation of the people of this country to resist Moscow's aggression and its dominion. It used to be, when I first came here, little old ladies and old men and children would be sitting together, meshing together camouflage netting. Today, there are little cottage, little mom and pop shops where they have 24/7 3D printers putting out drones. Okay, so there's no lack of motivation here.
Yeah.
It's just that they want to be able to fight this war effectively. And when it comes to this question of drones, I want to. This is a question I did want to talk with you about, and I'm gonna skip a couple questions, but as long as we're here, I'll talk about it. Drones have changed this war. The Ukrainians are very adept at taking into account new technologies and new techniques. The Russians are too, but they're a little slower to take on. How are drones changing this war, and where do you see that going? That drone factor.
Well, there's no doubt that drones have changed the character of the war. The ability to see, do reconnaissance day and night, to strike targets that in the past we might not have been able to hit. And of course, the scale. I mean, you can get so many drones at a relatively low price. And that technology, these capabilities, the warhead, the payload, and the range is only going to increase as we get more experience. But at the same time, I would also say that the ability to stop drones, to counter drones, is also going to improve. Whether it's through kinetic or non-kinetic means, I think non-kinetic actually are the most promising because when you can stop, as Ukrainians are already doing and as Russians are doing, when you can break that link, jam the signal, or do something that renders the drone ineffective, to be able to do that at scale, that's inevitable. I mean, technology is going to take you that way. So I would be careful that we don't draw the wrong conclusions. I mean, when you've had great military geniuses like Elon Musk said, well, tanks are stupid, we'll never have tanks. Okay, that's not true. I mean, the Ukrainians...
The great military expert Elon Musk, yes.
Yeah, the Ukrainians have, of course, used armored vehicles to great effect, including in this latest Kursk counteroffensive. So it still goes to tactical employment, training, and discipline, not just the technology. So I think the Ukrainians have made up for a lack of traditional air power with drones, being able to strike deep and hit targets that in the past we would have depended on our Air Force. Same thing in the Black Sea, as we've already discussed. I mean, the incredible effectiveness with which they have destroyed Russian ships with maritime unmanned systems. That has changed the character of maritime conflict. So yes, it's changed, but other than the atomic bomb, there is nothing that is a complete game changer.
Yeah, I mean, and when you saw in the First World War, it wasn't just the airplane; it was tanks or the machine gun. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a combination of these things.
And the change of technologies in general, not one specific technological system. I'm totally on board with you, having seen these drone operators in action. You've been critical of Western support for Ukraine and kind of how we have let down the side when it's come to the Budapest Memorandum, for example. Can we change course with that, especially with a new commander-in-chief coming in that has openly expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin and derided Ukrainian, Ukraine in general, but Ukrainian war efforts? You've been critical. Can we, especially with Trump coming in, change that?
Of course we can change it. The key was deciding what is in our best interest for the United States and for the West. And it's in my view, it's clearly in our strategic interest that Ukraine is successful, that Ukraine stops Russia. And it's in our interest because, number one, that would send a signal to the Chinese that we are committed to defeating Russia because of what Russia's doing to the international rules-based order. Sovereignty, international law, human rights, freedom of navigation, all these things. And so that's what the Chinese are doing or want to do in the Pacific. So if they see that we have the political will and the industrial capacity and the allies to help Ukraine win, I think the Chinese will be impressed with that. Right now, I don't think they're so impressed that we can't even muster the will, even though we have far superior industrial capacity to help Ukraine win, and that we have been so easily deterred by Russian threats of escalation. And Russia's never going to use a nuclear weapon, but we have been paralyzed by fear that somehow they might do it. That's been our problem. And I think if the Trump administration says, you know what, it's in our interests, and clearly that's what's going to drive Trump foreign policy is coercion as a method and what's in our U.S. interests, then I think he can see an opportunity to, number one, not be the loser, which is how it will be characterized, but also a chance to send that strong message to China that the United States has capability and has the will. Trump comes into office with much more leverage over Putin than he had 8 years ago. 8 years ago, Putin was at the top of his game. They were in a good place economically.
Everybody was afraid of him.
Right. Now, Trump comes in. Putin is much weaker than he was even a year ago. All the things we've already talked about. And Trump inherits a very strong U.S. economy and 31 allies that generally are looking for American leadership. Most of the allies want to see Ukraine win for the reasons we've all talked about. So he has the opportunity. Now, unfortunately, I haven't heard him say anything that gives me great hope. But I don't think actually in his own mind he knows what he's going to do yet. I was happy to see General Kellogg's statement that you cannot trust Russia. That's a good start point for any negotiation to acknowledge you cannot trust the other side. And also,
this is Keith Kellogg.
Right.
Keith Kellogg, Trump's appointed basically envoy to this situation.
That's correct.
I just wanted to clarify that for the audience.
And then General Kellogg has also talked about the importance of protecting Ukrainian sovereignty. So these are good things. But what I haven't heard is anybody in the administration say we have got to help Ukraine win because it's in our interest. This is not charity for Ukraine. This is in our interest.
We got about 5 minutes left here with the window you've provided with us, and we're very grateful for it again. So I'm going to try and get two more questions in here. And following up on what you've just said, I have heard in certain hallways and venues of kind of European power structure, not least of which guys like Guy Verhofstadt in the European Parliament, that they're starting to say if America is no longer a reliable military partner, that we might have to look at a European security alliance that might act independently from a transatlantic. I am both kind of, I understand that impetus, but I also see that would be exactly what Vladimir Putin would love to see, a breach in the transatlantic security alliance. What do you think about the European capacity if America is no longer a reliable partner to take up the slack?
Well, this is a really excellent question that you have brought up. Europe clearly has the potential to do this. I mean, the combined economies of Europe dwarfs Russia. So it boils down to political will. They could produce ammunition, equipment, all sorts of things if the decision was made to do it. So that's the key, is the political will. And I do sense, coming from the European Union, people like Dr. von der Leyen, who's the president of the Commission, Kaja Kallas, Andreas Kubilius, who are responsible for foreign relations and for defense inside the EU. It feels like, and I live here in Germany, that there's increasing awareness and willingness to do this, partly because they know that if the U.S. quits and Ukraine fails, it will be really bad for Europe in so many different ways. So I think there's a grim realization of that. But you're right that This is what the Soviets always wanted and what the Russians want, to separate the U.S. from Europe, and this will create that possibility.
Just last question here as we wind down, and allow me to do it from my perspective as a journalist. And I will say, I love talking to all sectors of people who are involved in this, whether it's academics or military experts or politicians for that matter. But coming from a journalistic perspective, I will tell you that it's my strong opinion that the Western press corps, and in particular the American press corps, has done a miserable, and pardon my language, piss poor job of covering this war. Americans don't know why we are supporting Ukraine. By and large, the narrative is Moscow has the initiative in the information warfare game that is not just about talk. There's a body count involved, because if the West does not support Ukraine, more Ukrainians are going to die. And Americans are not being properly, have it explained to them why it's in their interest to support Ukraine. How do you think we get the message through better to the West, all Western populations, but in particular an American population, if our press corps isn't going to do it?
Okay, you're correct in that. Every day I read 2 articles today already that talked about, the war started 3 years ago. No, it started 11 years ago. This is an important point to make when people are like, "Oh, come on, there's no way Ukraine can win." Say, what are you talking about? For 11 years, Russia still only controls 20%. So getting the start point right, I think, is an important part, and too many journalists kind of gloss over that. But I would put more of the responsibility on our political leaders for failing to make the case. The journalists obviously should be saying, "Well, Mr. President, why are we there? I mean, what are you trying to achieve?" And then not let them get away with a bullshit answer like, "Well, we're there with the Ukrainians for as long as it takes." That means nothing, and nobody believes it. But our political leaders have got to do a much better job of explaining what's our objective. Why are we there? Because the Biden administration, which did a lot of good for Ukraine, because they failed to clearly identify the objective, it left the door open for some people, people in Congress and across the country who don't like Ukraine or don't understand it, to say stupid stuff about, we're just shipping over hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, like it's pallets of money being delivered. And the administration failed miserably to explain to the average Americans why we're there, why this affects us, why it affects food prices, energy prices, is a risk to our security, et cetera, and connecting it to China. They failed to do it. And so, and they were aided in that by some, what the Germans call Kremlin-verstehers, academics in D.C. who tend to be pro-Russia. And they were, and also,
or at the very least, are Russia experts and come to it from a perspective of Russia. Very few Ukrainian experts exist in the Western world.
Well said.
Yeah, look, I know now because you are such a great proponent of and supporting the information warfare. I know you've got to run. So, General Ben Hodges, I appreciate your time. Would love to have you back anytime at all when you're available, and let us both try and do our best, and for everybody out there to do their best to try and counter Moscow's narrative. And I hope in some small form we've done that today. General Ben Hodges, thank you for your time.
Thanks for the privilege.